over to you, Professor.
President Matthew D. Kaiwan, President Fu Lee, esteemed members of IFOCA, and my lucky fellow residents in the new Malaysia. Good morning. The rise of civilization and the continued progress of the human condition owe much to the astounding creativity and engineering achievements of the building and construction industry. Members of the building and construction industry, I salute you for your immense contributions to the welfare of people everywhere. Today, I'll have two themes in my presentation. The first theme is that the world has now entered into a new international normal that is chaotic and potentially a threat to roll back on many of the achievements that we have gotten since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The second theme I want to talk about is China's suggestion of how to stabilize the new international normal with a Belt and Road program of infrastructure investment. I'd like to talk about the conditions under which such a program would succeed in producing the outcome of moderating the tumultuousness of the new international normal. Well, if there's one thing that economists believe in, is that trade is instinctive and good in its outcome. If free trade is not a win-win situation, why should anybody engage voluntarily in it? The fact that it occurs shows that trade produces an outcome that is favorable to all parties concerned. So the father of modern economics, Adam Smith, identifies the engine of growth to be the division of labor. Because of the ability to trade, we each specialize in what we do best. And by focusing on what we each do best and then trading among ourselves, output and innovation are both maximized. And this is why ever since the end of World War II, we have seen the proliferation of organizations that seek to promote multilateral free trade. You have in Europe, the European Common Market, which now has accumulated into the European Union, the North American Free Trade Area, which despite Trump's initial opposition to it, he has come and given it an update that would prolong its life. And over here, we have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that ASEAN has been pushing for Western Pacific, and the American-led alternative, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is true, just like NAFTA, where Trump wrote back in it in rhetorics in the beginning, I would say that the US temporary retreat from TPP is temporary, and in fact, unless the BRI does not succeed in stabilizing the new international normal, the United States and China would go on to form the APEC economic union. All these good things I've just said about free trade runs against the face of developments at least since 2016. In Europe, we have Brexit, and in the United States, we had Trump now having us initiating trade wars with almost everybody that the US has economic ties with. Well, there are some problems with globalization. And if we think back at history, dissatisfaction with globalization appeared very early. Just think about the opening up of East Asia. It started under the name of globalization. China was opened up for free trade in opium under the name of free trade is good for you. So, what has happened since the 1950s? Two things have been negative about globalization. The first is that the meaning of the word free trade and globalization has been hijacked by special interests to mean favoring one part of the international community over others. The second dissatisfaction with globalization that has led to Brexit and Trump's emergence is that the guardians of globalization have sometimes done a terrible job in safeguarding globalization. Let me be more specific. First, about how the meaning of globalization has been hijacked and used to benefit the multinational corporations. For example, what is one of the biggest items under all so-called gold standard trade agreements? The gold standard trade agreements, TPP, has nothing to do with trade in the sense of the movement of goods and services. It has more to do with the protection of capital. Specifically, one of the clauses that is pushed is called the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. If the foreign investor has a dispute with the host country government, instead of the dispute being settled under the rules of either the country where the FDI is from or the country in which the investment occurs, the settlement is done by a private company. It is done by an outside arbitrator. Why is it? Basically, we have outsourced the rule of law. Specifically, the best example of this is Philip Morris in the early 2000s. Philip Morris made a big investment in producing cigarettes in Uruguay. Then the Uruguayan government had the guts to promote an anti-smoking campaign. And Philip Morris clearly recognizes this anti-smoking campaign as having negative consequences on its profitability. And under the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, Philip Morris sued the Uruguayan government for causing its investment to lose money. In other words, telling the Uruguayan government, you have no right to protect public health. So it is incidents like this that have led many to reject globalization. And take another example of what globalization is. We all think of globalization as the free movement of goods. I'm for it. Then it has been expanded to mean the free movement of capital across national boundaries. But without equivalent free movement of labor across international boundaries. So what's the outcome of this free movement of capital across international boundaries? Basically, a disproportionate amount of Apple profits are booked under the subsidiary in Dublin, the Republic of Ireland. Basically, capital flee, the location, the registered home of capital flees to the areas of lowest rate of capital taxation. But in a modern economy, what is fair taxation for government programs to support education and other programs in technological innovation? You have to tax capital, you have to tax labor. But because capital can run and labor cannot run, what we have is every developed country, G20 country, is facing a fiscal crisis because it's unable to tax its capital. And all of it, the weight of funding government programs has fallen on the wage earner. So we see the populist backlash that has led to the emergence of Trump and other nationalist, populist political forces elsewhere in the world. Besides that, but clearly these are things that could be fixed. There could be a global compact on the minimum capital tax rate around the world. This, rather than every country competing to cut tax rates on capital. Then, of course, for us in East Asia, we remember the incompetence of the IMF in combating the Asian financial crisis. What was going to be a major recession was turned into a regional slump due to the wrong policies of the International Monetary Fund. So, given the fact of this incompetence and the unfair nature of the working of international organizations, there is a backlash against globalization. So right now, I have said some of the things that have gone wrong with the globalization process. But I do not support a rollback of globalization. I do not support a rollback of globalization because I think that the illnesses that I have identified could be fixed without having to roll back globalization. What do we learn from the last time where there was a rollback in globalization? The lesson of what happened the last time we rolled back globalization is in a magisterial book by Charles Kinderberger called The World in Depression. Basically, what was a major recession in the US was propagated to the rest of the world when all the countries individually imposed tariff on imports. Basically, by stopping imports from everybody, everybody is also exporting less. And since everybody is exporting less, the result was a descent into the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the 1930s was directly the result of deglobalization. That's the mechanism. The mechanism was deglobalization. But there have always been regional crises, but they never resulted in a global depression before. So what was it that was different in the 1930s? Charles Kinderberger's interesting explanation is that the reason why a major regional recession became a global depression is because at that point in time there was the lack of a global leader. Why is a global leader important? A country could be a global leader only if it has overwhelming economic force, such that when there is a recession outside that country, it will continue to keep its market open to soak in the surplus production from abroad. And at the same time, this large economic country would have the financial resources to bail out and recapitalize the countries in problems. In technical terms, the global leader is the consumer of last resort as well as the lender of last resort. And before the 1914, the United Kingdom was the global leader. In fact, the term for it is the hegemonic global leader. In other words, the UK was disproportionately larger than all the other countries, and so it had the economic power to be able to stabilize the world. And not only to stabilize the world through its own economic might, but to be able to beat down on other countries to fall in line. So, when you have got a global hegemon, you may have economic stability, but it may not be a happy group because the leader could be beating down on everybody else. And in the 1920s, by that time, the UK was no longer the biggest country in the world. The biggest country in the world was the United States. But the United States did not then have the mentality that it should assume this global role. And because of the US failure to act, or maybe the US was just not big, still not big enough by then, the result was a descent into the Great Global Depression. The idea here is a leaderless world is a world that is prone to the proliferation of protectionism that ultimately make everybody worse off. Having told you this story, it might be hard for some of you to believe, because when you think of the UK, this small island country on the edge of the European continent, how could it have ever viewed that much power? Well, we in Malaysia could be more easily convinced. For those of you outside Malaysia, I'd like to show you the following diagram. The countries in red are the countries that the UK had attacked in the last 100 years before 1914. That's what you mean by being the hegemonic leader. If a country doesn't listen to you, you beat them into shape. There are only 20, let us exaggerate, 22 countries is too small. 44, that's what another estimate is. But the map would look marginally different. If you think of the US military alliance after World War II, you would have an alliance that would cover a large part of the world. But now things have changed. The emergence of China has made the US no longer the leading global power. The question is China likely to be the next global hegemon? Right now, the United States, in terms of purchasing power measured in terms of living standard, China has the ability, the amount of output of China is equivalent to the output of the United States, and with per capita of China only less than 1/4 of the United States. Oh, sorry, 1/3 today. So if China were to catch up with the United States, the Chinese GDP would be 3 times the US GDP. So would China likely to be the new global hegemon by 2050? Let's say 2060, if you want to be pessimistic. The answer is, if it is true, then we are likely to have systemic stability again, because there would be a leader. Well, the unfortunate answer is China will not be, I should not say unfortunate, the answer is that China will not be the new global hegemon in 2060. It's not. In fact, from now onwards, there'll be no more global hegemons. The reason is that I think to believe otherwise is to underestimate the future rise of India. The rise of India will bring about a country that will be at least as big as China by 2060. Let's say in 2060, India per capita is only 70% that of China. But the Indian population at that time will be 30% larger than China, making total purchasing power in India the same as in China. So given the fact that we will not go back to a situation of global hegemony, does it mean that we are doomed to global instability? Well, I think that the key is to come up with an arrangement that is appropriate for a multipolar world. Basically, we have to think of a new global economic architecture. We cannot go back to the way the world was organized under the UK or the way the world was organized under the US, because there will be no single leading power. What we need is to think of an international governance mechanism that makes shared global governance that results in shared global prosperity. So, what are the things that needs to be done? I have to tell you that what I have just said is seen as naive by many people. I have been to many conferences on the rise in China. Sooner or later, someone would say, the global history is characterized by clash between the rising power and the status quo power. Talk about the rise of Germany for the First World War, the rise of Japan in the Second World War. And so Graham Allison talks about, it goes back earlier, the rise of Sparta and the clash with Athens. It is true that the rise of new powers have occasionally led to disasters, but that is not necessary, because the rise of the United States was not accompanied with a clash with the then former hegemonic power. What happened? The US rose and the UK declined. But there was no clash between the two. In fact, the two cooperated to fight the two world wars. So the fact, is it because that they both spoke English and so there was no need to fight between the two powers, the English and the UK? If speaking the same language is so important, why was there a civil war between northern states of the USA and the southern states of the USA in 1860? Basically, if speaking the same language means that there would be global peace, then you look at the EU. With Brexit, how do you think the EU meetings are held? Even without UK in the hall, they're always speaking English to each other. Look at the European Central Bank. None of the countries of English has their mother tongue, but they all end up speaking that language. But anyway, the important point is, clearly, there are some factors, some institutional mechanisms, whereby that transition from UK to US is made without sparkling a global conflict. And could we not put in the same institutional mechanisms today to accommodate the rise of China and India? I think, let me now get back to talk about what the agenda for global governance should be in a multipolar world, and what does that mean for us was in ASEAN. And, excuse me. When you think of a multipolar world, you think of a world that is divided into spheres of influence. The United States, that was the Madison Doctrine, where Europe was told, keep away from Latin America, that's my backyard. And if you see what's happening in the Ukraine and the South China Sea, this is the emergence of spheres of influence. And spheres of influence in the past have been rather unequal to the members within each sphere. You have colonialism, and you have the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. What we need to do now is that each sphere of influence should become a sphere of regional development. Rather than domination, it is the idea of let's get rich together. And the Chinese proposal of the One Belt, One Road, or now rebranded as the Belt Road Initiative, is an attempt to build infrastructure that would bind the China's neighboring countries in an attempt to move to a higher level of common prosperity. And many people have said, when you have too many cooks, you spoil the soup. So when the Chinese set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to finance the bank and road projects, the American Treasury sent round officials to every capital in the Western Pacific and tell them not to join. That's why the strongest US allies like Japan is not a member. They came to Malaysia and they told Malaysia not to join AIIB. They told Indonesia not to join AIIB. And that did not work, largely because the United States was telling each ASEAN country to shoot itself in the foot. And so the United States, by putting its foot in its mouth, basically discredited itself. Competition is good. The reason why ASEAN had such a terrible outcome during the Asian financial crisis was only because there was no Asian Monetary Fund. And an Asian Monetary Fund would be like an Asian fire station. You ask yourself, how many fire stations should there be in the world? Well, as many as you can afford. Asia is rich enough to afford its own monetary fund. Africa is not able to. Just look at what happens in the Greek crisis when it happened. When the Greek crisis happened, the IMF wanted to jump in, and what did the Europeans say? The Europeans said, thank you, we don't need your money, we have plenty ourselves, we will do what that is needed. The European Stabilization Fund was formed. So competing international institutions is good, and they don't let, basically they compete and they cooperate, and the outcome is better. Now let's take a look at what's been proposed by China. As you could see, this is going to be an immense undertaking which would enable international trade to occur on a larger scale and in a shorter time than before. And excuse me, I think what is the key thing we should keep in mind when you have got competing blocks, different spheres of regional development? The important thing is they all must work together to keep trade free with members outside of each sphere. The WTO system has to be maintained. That is the overriding consideration in this multipolar world that we have today. Now let's talk quickly to what should be the navigation strategy for ASEAN. What could ASEAN do to mobilize the Belt and Road Initiative for its own development? The first thing to know is to recognize what has been keeping us backwards. One of them is inadequate physical infrastructure. Like if you look at Indonesia, a large part of Indonesian goods are shipped through Singapore, and that is very unnatural. This is a pelagic country. And if you look at the number of airports in Indonesia, you are also shocked by the small number and inadequate nature of the infrastructure. Then, of course, there is inadequate human resources, such that countries cannot move up the value-added chain very quickly. And in the case of Malaysia, that's best epitomized by two things. The low PISA score that our high schools, PISA scores are the international comparison of how each country scores in science, math, science, math, writing. I forgot the fourth. But anyway, for a country, given how much Malaysia spends on education per student, our score is that of a country that spends less than 1/3 amount per student that we do. Somehow we spend a lot, but we are not getting the outcome we want. Low PISA score, and the other one is the high rate of upward migration of skilled personnel from Malaysia. So the inadequate human resources is certainly what's holding us back, and the other one is the low administrative capability of many countries. What I have identified there, I say this is what they keep us backwards. But what is backwardness? Backwardness is exactly these three characteristics. You don't have the money to develop a good education system. You don't have the money to build the infrastructure you need. You don't have the money to be able to afford the kind of services that the government could provide. So this is both the chicken and the egg. It's the symptom of the problem as well as the cause of the problem. So what do you do when you have got a situation that fits on each other and keeping you in the middle income trap in the case of Malaysia? Well, what shakes you out of that? The Malaysian voters have decided on May 9th this year that we need a change in the leadership, but good intentions is not enough. You've got to have the resources to implement what that is necessary. So a large outside flow of investment funds would greatly boost the physical infrastructure and improve the education and training in the country. So how can Malaysia get the external funding? Well, one thing for sure, a multipolar world means that we face a world where the big boys are competing among themselves. If the tension between the big boys is very low, they agree on everything, that is not so good. We will have peace, but we won't have much independence of action. If we do anything different, the two of them will beat us back into line. If the level of tension among the big powers is at a medium level, they will all come bearing presents. The Belt and Road Initiative from China and the TPP package that the United States offered Malaysia. What was the TPP package the United States offered Malaysia? It's not because, it's partly that Dr. Mustafa is a good negotiator, and partly because the Americans say, all these conditions you don't like, we waive it. You don't have to implement it for the next 30 years. Why? Because the Americans cannot start a club, the TPP, with no members. So how do you get the members? You waive all the difficulties. So that was because it's in competition with China. But if the level of competition among the countries is extremely high, then we face a situation where the big boys turn to us in ASEAN and say, if you are not on my side, you are against me. Basically, we get the side chosen for us. That is the worst possible outcome. And how can we prevent tensions from escalating from the present medium-term level to the high level? I think what Dr. Mahathir says about allowing warships of different countries to sail through the South China Sea is okay, but just don't stay there. And that demand can only be made if ASEAN as a group stands by a commitment to neutrality. So what we do ourselves is very important in keeping the level of tensions among the big boys low. Suppose we do succeed in it, what should we ask money for under the BRI program? Clearly, we need to greatly expand the transportation and communication facilities, seaports, airports, and broadband. It is such a farce when a previous Malaysian Minister of Communications, when questioned in Parliament why the broadband speed is so low in Malaysia, his answer was, Malaysians like it this way. He certainly was not a fast thinker, for sure. So, what should the building and construction industry be? The code should make the wiring of broadband communication something that is compulsory in all new construction. And that transfer in technology can be gotten from China and many of our Northeast Asian neighbors. So the other one has to do with, we got to greatly boost the education sector. And one of them is the model of India. At the time of independence, what did Nehru ask of the European countries that would then say, what could we do to help build your country? Sukarno said, build us the Selamat Datang statue, build us the monarch statue. And Nehru said, the leading institution in each European country should partner and build an Indian Institute of Technology in each major area of the country. And the reason why India is the home of the IT industry has a lot to do with this right decision at the beginning of the founding of the Republic. So similarly, in the case of ASEAN, I think we should be asking under BRI, not only infrastructure investment, but investment in our universities. And we have to understand that economic growth counts because the kind of technology that is employed is appropriate to the ecological conditions of that place. Ask yourself, how did Nebraska and Iowa in the United States get rich? The first place to get rich are the places that can engage in international trade, like the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. How did the center get rich? The center got rich because of the setting up of the land-grant universities, whereby the government told the local universities, develop seeds that have higher productivity, develop the right fertilizer for our soil conditions, develop the appropriate irrigation system. the reason why there was an agricultural revolution in China after the 1978 had to do with the mobilization of the regional universities to develop agriculture in the places where there's a surplus population. Most agricultural regions develop through two things. What they produce with greater efficiency, and that comes from science. Supply and develop in the local universities. And the other one is the people move to cities and get higher paying industrial jobs. So when we think about infrastructure investment, this is what that allows the cities to unleash the potential for economic development. So in the finding, that everything I say could be summed up in the last two slides. The first thing is, it's true that the international system is fragmenting, but there is good fragmentation and bad fragmentation. Good fragmentation means globalization in a collective leadership setting, such as the supply of global public goods by the major powers in each sphere. And that fragmentation is the kind of fragmentation that happened in the 19th century and the 20th centuries. But the Belt and Road Initiative is no guarantee of success. What is important is that there should be no incompetence in assessing the economic and financial stability of the project. Because a bad project would just waste resources in the country. It's like the assessment of the new harbor in Sri Lanka. The assessment was done, unfortunately, not too good, and the result was the project was in trouble and now turns over to China for management. And the other thing is, BRI is money flowing in, and unfortunately, the administration of that money has to be done in a way which does not delegitimize the government of the day. Money flowing in means opportunities for corruption, giving Chinese companies giving fat contracts to subcontractors who are friends of the government of the day, resulting in huge cost overrun, and ultimately undermine the socio-political stability of the country. And infrastructure building is compatible with environmental protection. Green building is, I think, the necessary orientation of the building and construction industry from this point onwards for collective survival. So the BRI program that China designs, China should take note, therefore, of the three things. First, economic viability of the projects. Second, the social-political integrity of the project. And third, the environmental friendliness of the project. So this is the opportunity that members of IFOCA have a chance of participating in and insisting that they be implemented according to these three principles that I've outlined here. Thank you very much. I look forward to getting your comments.